let me tell you a story about Roger Revelle. UCSD was founded in the late 1950s, meant to be the next great research university in the Pacific. It was in many ways the brainchild of Roger Revelle, then the director of the Scripps Institute of Oceanography. But he faced an uphill battle. La Jolla's exclusionary covenants meant that the university had to make their own housing subdivision just so Jewish professors could live there. Some regions complained to UC President Clark Kerr that Revelle was hiring, quote, Jews and communists. Senior Regent Edwin Pauley stood firm against the establishment of UCSD. He disliked Revelle, and he thought that UCB in LA should just have been made bigger. Still, Revelle pushed for his vision, because he loved the university. One particularly romantic episode Revelle would later recall, quote, there were many beautiful trees on what is now the Revelle campus, and I was afraid that the contractors would just mindlessly cut them down when they started building. So I spent 2 afternoons up there, wrapping colored ribbons around the trees I thought should be saved. And I believe many of them were. UC President Kerr would later say of Revelle, he dreamed about this campus. He put a lot into it. He used to come up here on the ridge on a moonlit evening and think what the campus would look like when it was built. Which is why Kerr would say that one of the most difficult moments of his life was when he had to tell Roger Revelle that he would not be the chancellor of UCSD. Revelle had opponents in La Jolla and on the Board of Regents, and he was an academic, not a bureaucrat. The political capital Kerr would need to spend to make Revelle chancellor was just better used elsewhere. Revelle was heartbroken, and Kerr shared a few very sad moments with him. Kerr would later say simply, Roger deserved it. Still, the newborn university would have Revelle's fingerprints all over it, from the residential colleges to its dismissal of big-time athletics. Revelle had long believed that UCSD should never have a football team, going so far as to say in October 1956 that if it ever had one, he hoped it would never win a game. Call it a curse, or call it karma, but in 1968, the most tumultuous year in the history of UC San Diego, Roger Revelle got his wish. It's September 24th, 1967, and UC San Diego has just opened its second college named after environmentalist John Muir. Look at Chancellor John Galbraith, doesn't he just look jazzed to have a new college? Hey look, it's the exact same picture of him over here on the same page. I wonder why they... Oh. Bye, John. I don't blame him, really. Galbraith was tired of being an administrator, and he was being offered a fellowship at Cambridge in England. He would later say in a quote that I sourced literally just from the wall in Galbraith Hall, I made my decision to go to Cambridge knowing that I was closing the door on a career in administration for all time. I've never regretted that decision. The campus that Galbraith left is a fledgling one, occupying a fraction of the land that it does today. His successor, William McGill, accepts the job only after the first 5 people offered the gig turn it down. This is off topic, but just indulge me for a second. The new UCSD newspaper helpfully lists all the clubs on campus and who to contact about them, and hey, that's neat, there's a linguistics club. Linguistics is really cool, so I looked up this guy's name to see what became the first UCSD linguistics club president, and here he is on Wikipedia. Why is he on Wikipedia? Oh no. The contact for the linguistics club was killed in a 2010 triple murder in New Mexico. Look, I had to tell somebody, and now you know, I'm sorry. Anyway, meanwhile, the first mention of football at UCSD shows up as demand grows among some for an intercollegiate football team. The university administration is resistant, fearing the impacts that this could have on athletics, but it's a pretty small item in the newspaper. If students want to watch sports, they can watch the first ever game for the NBA's newest team, the San Diego Rockets. They'll stick around, right? Mostly students are worried about a cafeteria crisis. The food provided by the profit food company sucks, it's expensive, and students now can only eat in their assigned dining halls. The next week, it's the parking that draws the ire of the newspaper. Nowhere to park, confusing permit systems, and the editorial jokes about spots that are reserved for employees except after 5 o'clock on alternate Tuesdays and Thursdays, and then only if it's 52 degrees Fahrenheit and raining. So the parking and the food at UCSD suck. I guess the more things change, the more they stay the same. The petition for a UCSD football team grows to 500 signatures, and its proponents plan to present it to AS when it reaches 1,000. The Triton Times sports correspondent imagines an even more ambitious future, though, one where UCSD's future 12 colleges have their own football season where they just play each other. A future headline he foresees: Revelle and Mohr in pigskin playoff. Okay, hold on. Can you imagine a Mohr college football team? I love that. That's great. But in a theme we'll see over and over again, football is ultimately in the back seat when compared to broader developments. Because it is 1967, and a war rages in Vietnam, and ideological divisions on America's campuses are deeper than they ever have been or ever will be again. In Revelle Plaza, the students of the Independent Left, the largest left-wing student organization on campus, which will later join the National Students for a Democratic Society, hold a celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution that created the Soviet Union. Things get a little tense, although not physical. They also serve juice. Says one student, "When I get up in the morning, I say to myself that I hate America and hate living in America." When asked why she doesn't leave, she says she can't get a passport. But that's not the most inflammatory thing the SIL protesters do. Infamously, next to the poster of Vladimir Lenin, they fly the Viet Minh flag, the flag of Ho Chi Minh, which, if you're keeping score, the US was kind of fighting a war with at the time. This, as you can imagine, didn't go over very well, and the flag was torn down, burned, and the remains hung in the eucalyptus trees of the Matthews campus. In response, the young Republicans take up a collection for a flagpole in Revelle Plaza that will fly the American flag. It's still there today. Meanwhile, in the back of the newspaper, a master's student named Angela Davis advertises for the Black Students' Council. Seriously, here is Angela Davis's phone number. I don't recommend calling, it's probably too late to join. A few days later, a bunch of Marines come over to campus to tear down the flag that they read about in the newspaper. They find out pretty quickly that the flag hadn't been flying for a while, at which point they start a heated discussion with student protesters before being asked to leave by two deans. Says one of my buddies died in Vietnam trying to grab a commie flag from one of the hills, and these students try to fly the flag. That week also sees another visitor hostile to the students come to campus, California Governor Ronald Reagan, in town for a UC Regents meeting at UCSD. Reagan denounces the students who flew the flag and calls on the Regents to pass legislation banning the protests, as well as sit-ins at Berkeley. It won't work this time, but don't worry, he'll be back soon. The new year of 1968 brings with it changes for the UCSD campus. Ironically, despite the fact that the current library is in Galbraith Hall, the new Central Library is largely the vision of former Chancellor Galbraith himself, who had a vision for something completely new. Hell, he had even threatened to resign back in 1965 if the Regents didn't allow the funding for the library. It's designed by William Pereira, the architect behind LAX's iconic theme building and San Francisco's iconic Transamerica Pyramid. And while the eventual design will vary from Pereira's original model, let's just say it looks pretty cool. But that's not all that's new, because UCSD finally has its football team, and it finally has its coach. Walt Hackett was a native of nearby Ramona, and he coached his way up the ranks from Bellflower High School to Cerritos College to Baylor to his last job running the San Diego Chargers defense. There are some top athletes at the school, says Hackett, but this school is not in the field to manufacture pros. After all, at UCSD, we've got nerdier things to get excited about. Anyway, at the first meeting of the team with 50 prospective players in attendance, Hackett acknowledges the limits of the school for football. Education is the reason you are here. Remember that, he says. Notes the writer, try to get a chemistry prof to agree that you must have 2 extra days on your lab because you had to play football. Practices will work around classes, not the other way around, and they'll last for no more than 2 hours. But Hackett shocks those present when he tells them that UCSD isn't, like many schools, going to start with a couple of years in the junior varsity or JC ranks. We're going straight to varsity, he says. April 1968 will see the announcement of UCSD's football schedule and the beginning of spring practice, with some of Hackett's old players from the Chargers supervising. But if you're keeping track of history from this time, you'll know that none of that mattered.
I have some very sad news for all of you, and that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
Classes are cancelled and a rally is held in Revelle Plaza with drastically differing opinions. While Chancellor Galbraith calls for reconciliation, the head of the Black Students' Union is less measured. The assassination, he says, concludes that period in American history when the black oppressed appealed non-violently to the conscience of the white oppressors. After his speech, the black students present stage a silent walkout. After the rally, several hundred students marched through La Jolla against racism. One La Jolla resident was less than pleased with that, angrily remarking, "There's no racism in La Jolla." This is, if I can remind you, a neighborhood where black and Jewish people literally couldn't own a home until 1964, 4 years ago. There's literally an anti-Semitism section on the La Jolla Wikipedia page. You can't make that up. UCSD actually had to create their own new housing subdivision just so Jewish professors could live here. It was bad enough that Professor Aaron Novick, who had accepted an offer to come here, decided not to because of the anti-Semitic prejudice of La Jolla. He later went on to become one of the founders of the field of molecular biology. La Jolla was so racist that it was driving away a future titan of biology, but sure, there's no racism in La Jolla. Anyway, things continue on campus. The cheerleaders began to select their uniforms for the upcoming season, the students and faculty compete in donkey basketball. Richard Feynman is slated to be UCSD's commencement speaker, normal college stuff. There are ways in which the UCSD of 1968 really reminds one of the UCSD of today. Take this article entitled "Thursday Was a Bore." Tom Lehrer, the great satirist, mathematician, and musician who you most likely know from writing the Elements song, is playing Revelle Plaza, which the author says has a total lack of aesthetic appeal. Our author and probably the largest crowd in the history of the university show up. His Hume TA accosts him to remind him of his unfinished papers, and anyway, it turns out Tom Lehrer isn't there. Nobody's replacing him. Everybody goes home. Says the author, "This is the ultimate Revelle College event, the anti-event. Nothing happened, and the massive crowd did not seem to care." He contemplates. "It seems to be a characteristic of the normal Revellian to be bored and not to care. We do nothing, we feel nothing, and we do not really care. Quite possibly, boredom is the basis of life as we live it. Quite possibly, is the basis of our identity." But UCSD is not all boredom. For some, it's a hotbed of the counterculture, led by Herbert Marcuse, a German-born UCSD professor who is a prominent figure in the Frankfurt School and who is widely credited as the father of the New Left. He's also Angela Davis's graduate advisor.
Herbert Marcuse taught me that it was possible to be an academic and an activist, a scholar and a revolutionary.
Marcuse is by far UCSD's most controversial faculty member at the time, and he's the subject of much press attention.
Professor Marcuse teaches philosophy at the San Diego campus of the University of California. Well, how is it, Professor, in this country of unprecedented prosperity that there can emerge so powerful a force of discontent?
I believe it is precisely because of the prosperity that you have such a tremendous spread of discontent. How instead of construction, destruction is practiced.
What do you mean destructive uses? I don't...
For example, the entire military establishment.
Well, setting that aside.
For example, planned obsolescence. For example, the production of innumerable brands and gadgets who are, in the last analysis, all the same.
This very month in Paris, the May 68 protests bring the French economy to a screeching halt, as left-wing student protests spiral into a wider general strike involving a quarter of the French population. If you watch the French Dispatch, like the part with Timothée Chalamet, it's based on these protests. Behind the barricades, and as they hurl the paving stones of the Parisian streets amidst the tear gas, they chant, "Marx, Mao, Marcuse." Marcuse, for his part, travels to Paris to observe the situation and speaks to packed crowds, discovering that he is being considered the ideological inspiration for the movement. He returns to the UCSD campus to deliver a report on the situation in France. Okay, so this isn't important, but Marcuse also loves hippopotamuses, and I can't not talk about it. He was fascinated by them, often visiting the hippo enclosure at the San Diego Zoo and keeping many stuffed hippos of his own in his office.
He had at least 20 to 30 figurines of hippopotamuses. Pink hippopotamuses, green hippopotamuses, hippopotamuses with their mouths wide open, hippopotamus candy jars. And he loved hippopotamuses. He would speak of them as a bizarre animal. And he felt they embodied the reality of absurdity and the immense possibilities of the imagination.
Anyway, Marcuse is quickly becoming one of the most prominent left-wing public intellectuals in the country, and with Ronald Reagan as governor, this is surely a road to conflict. But we'll get there later, because it's time for summer break. When we come back, I promise we're actually going to play some football. Not before one more surprise, though.
Senator Kennedy has been shot. Is that possible? It is possible. He has, and possibly shot in the head. I am right here. Rafer Johnson has a hold of a man who apparently has fired the shot. That's it, Rafer. Get it. Get the gun, Rafer.
UCSD plays its first varsity intercollegiate football game ever at home on September 28, 1968 against Laverne College, now the University of Laverne. Walt Hackett only has 31 men to his team. General admission is $1 or about $8.50 in today's money. Surprisingly, the Tritons strike first in their very first contest, taking a 6-0 lead in the second quarter on a run from quarterback Greg Gleason. But it's the last time they'll score, as Laverne pours on the next 41 points to turn the early deficit into a blowout. Says Coach Hackett, "We must be realistic, we will be underdogs in every game we play this season." And how? UCSD itself doesn't have a suitable field, so summer practices were held at the Marine Corps Recruitment Depot. Home games, including this contest against Laverne, are played on a field near campus on Old Miramar Road, which we've outfitted with the new bleachers and a scoreboard. According to later sources, at the first game, the all-new Triton cheerleading squad chants USCD. It's going great. That month, Black Panther Minister of Information Eldridge Cleaver is on the UCSD campus to speak, amidst legal troubles, controversy over a course he will lecture for at UC Berkeley, and a protest run for president. In 1957, at the age of 18, Cleaver had been convicted of sexual assault with intent to murder, and while in prison, he obtained his high school diploma, read widely, and wrote his acclaimed book Soul on Ice, which is already being taught in Hume courses at UCSD. He has risen quickly to become second in command in the Black Panther Party. Cleaver is amidst an appellate court battle over an attempted murder charge after leading an ambush on a policeman in Oakland in the riots in the aftermath of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, and next month he will jump bail to flee to Cuba to escape punishment. But that's in the future. Just earlier this week, he spoke at Sacramento State and said this.
Fuck you, Ronnie Baby. I believe that Ronald Reagan is a punk, a sissy, and a coward, and I challenge him to a duel. I challenge the punk to a duel to the death, and he can choose his own weapons. Could be a gun, a knife, or marshmallow. I'll beat him to death with a marshmallow.
Upon arriving in San Diego this month, he has an agreeable dinner with Faculty Academic Senate Chairman Walter Munk, with armed, leather-clad Black Panther bodyguards stationed outside of Monk's home in La Jolla. But tonight, he is in main gym, and he leads the audience in a 17-second chant of "Fuck Ronald Reagan," which is bad enough language for the time that the Triton Times had to print an editor's note next to it. In response, Chancellor McGill will later dismiss Cleaver's obscenities, largely to allay the fears of Marxist encroachment on UCSD from notoriously conservative San Diego locals, saying, "Cleaver opens up with a 5-minute nightclub act and then goes into obscenities. Then he closes with a kindergarten chat about Marxism." The same month, many UCSD students attend a rally in San Diego by a man who can be described only as the complete opposite of Eldridge Cleaver, Alabama governor and third-party presidential candidate of segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever fame, George Wallace. The Tritons in attendance are split firmly into two camps. Some of the assembled crowd wave pro-Wallace signage with messages about supporting the police, breaking up demonstrations, stopping school busing, and defeating anarchists and communists. The hand-painted signs from the anti-Wallace contingent meanwhile read things like "pseudo-intellectuals for Wallace" and "freaks for Wallace." This gets the governor mad. "You anarchists have your day now, because after November 5th you're through in this country, I'll tell you," shouts Wallace. He criticizes the protesters for their profanity, saying the 2 4-letter words that they need are WORK and SOAP. "We want soap," chant his supporters. The protesters eventually rattle Wallace so much that he needs to go backstage for a bit to confer with his aides. Said the Triton Times writer on the scene, it seemed that Wallace was confused that some of the UCSD students were on his side and others were heckling him. One group chanted, "We want Wallace." The other pejoratively chanted, "Sieg Heil." Wallace ends by turning on the universities, saying that students on college campuses are raising money, food, and clothing for the communists, and they're flying the Viet Cong flag. Hey, that's us. Wallace also says that any professor or student calling for communist victory will be in a federal jail when he's in charge. Luckily, he won't be, although he does draw 7% of the San Diego County vote in next month's presidential election. The same week, UCSD has its next football game, this one at Loyola Marymount. The Tritons fumbled the ball into the end zone in the first quarter for a Loyola touchdown, and it doesn't get much better from there as they fall 34-14. The offensive line is improved, but the defense still needs work. They give up 3 long pass interference calls that lead to Loyola touchdowns. But UCSD quarterback Greg Gleason throws 2 touchdowns, and Coach Hackett says that he's learning the system quickly. The next week, we see that the Triton cheerleading squad is still recruiting in an ad so bizarre that I can't do anything but read it to you. Heterosexuals. Are you leading a humdrum life? Do you wake up every morning looking forward to spending 8 hours in the library? Has the pizzazz in your life settled to the bottom of the glass? Well, here is your big chance to get into some action. UCSD is holding tryouts for cheerleading this Monday, October 28th at 8 p.m. in the gym. Don't think that you have to be one of those raving beauties who can do a 2.5 back somersault from a standing position. There's no previous experience necessary. If you think you can do a good job promoting spirit, that's all you need. Well, y'all, what are you doing reading to the end of the stupid article for? Go call 453-1412. I wonder if that ad worked. The next Triton football game takes place at home against Cal Western, which today is just a law school. Just like in their opener, the Tritons strike first to open the game as John Ringwood takes back a Cal Western punt for an 80-yard return all the way down to the 5-yard line, and Greg Gleason takes it in for the score. The Tritons lead 7-0. But just like in their first game against Laverne, their first score will also be their last score of the game, and that 80-yard return is more yards than the offense is able to muster all day. Cal Western scores 34 unanswered, and while the Triton defense is strong, the limited number of line players and multiple two-way athletes means that fatigue hits like a brick in the final quarter. All told, UCSD only manages 68 yards to the Westerners' 340, but they do get 88 yards on returns and 96 on penalties. Still, Hackett and the fans are pleased with the effort of the team. Cal Western is apparently the best team the Tritons have faced so far, and they failed to embarrass the Tritons, which is apparently the standard we're playing for this season. The sports editor reports that the football game is having its intended effect, giving students something fun to watch and creating a sense of campus unity as students and faculty alike cheer on Ringwood's punt return. Plus, watching the cheerleaders try to spell UCSD is providing a real asset to the game day experience. Next game is at Caltech, a school that has not won a varsity football game in 4 years. Nobody on the Caltech team has ever won a game. You already know where this is going. But as the football season takes shape, campus tensions have grown in anticipation of a Regents meeting on November 22nd that will bring the UC's leaders and Governor Ronald Reagan to Main Gym. But before we get to that Regents meeting, we need to establish a little context on what's going on from both the past and the future. The previous meeting at UC Santa Cruz, where students called for the establishment of a Malcolm X college, was boisterous and combative. Here's liberal Regent William Coblentz, an attorney who legally represented Jefferson Airplane and the Grateful Dead, negotiated with Patty Hearst's kidnappers, and once called Governor Reagan a menopausal Cary Grant, blocking a door from students trying to rush the meeting. Both the Regents and UCSD administration fear the same happening in La Jolla. All the talk is about a set of new resolutions proposed at the UCSC meeting by Governor Reagan, which the Triton Times reprints with the heading, "An End to Academic Freedom." In the resolutions, Reagan consolidates power with the regents, asserting their authority to appoint faculty, confer degrees, invite lecturers, and initiate courses, all powers traditionally delegated to the faculty. These policies are a direct reaction to the course Eldridge Cleaver has attempted to teach at Berkeley, and Reagan says that any course where Cleaver speaks more than once will not be accredited, and any faculty member who recognizes work in Cleaver's Social Analysis 139X will be subject to disciplinary action. This isn't happening in a vacuum, by the way. Reagan was at least in part elected in 1966 as a response to perceived lawlessness in the student protests at UC Berkeley. In fact, his close political advisor and eventual press secretary, Lynn Nofziger, said that Reagan had no particular issue with the university. He didn't even really know much about it. But his advisors told him that he should run from the right wing, after all that's where the money was, and the pollster said there were 3 issues he should pursue: welfare queens, mental health malingerers, and the student revolt at Berkeley. So Reagan went all in. He promised in his campaign to clean up the mess at Berkeley, where there had been, and I quote, "sexual orgies so vile I cannot describe them to you." He famously called Berkeley itself a haven for communist sympathizers, protesters, and sex deviants. He pledged to appoint a committee led by former CIA Director John McCone to investigate communism and sexual misbehavior on the Berkeley campus. But things went even deeper than it seemed at the time. In 2002, the San Francisco Chronicle's Seth Rosenfeld reported on declassified FBI documents that revealed that McCone, the FBI, Regent Pauley, the very same guy who wouldn't let Roger Revelle become chancellor, and the Reagan campaign had colluded to blacklist and falsify information about UC President Clark Kerr due to his support for student protesters and his liberal anti-war views. They also produced reports on a guy William Coblentz. Even worse, and this still makes me mad, when President Johnson tapped Kerr to become the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, the FBI sent information that they knew was false to the White House that Kerr was pro-communist as part of his routine background check, sinking his candidate for a cabinet position with a lie. Seriously, I'm fuming about this to this day. But back in 1966, Reagan won the election in a landslide, and the first item on his agenda was to fire Clark Kerr. And he did. Reagan appointed several new regents, and the new conservative majority dismissed Kerr in the very first meeting in 1967. Soon after, Kerr would joke that he left the presidency of the university just as he had entered it. Fired with enthusiasm. So, with all this context, the fate of the entire UC system seemingly on the line, and one of the most tense events in UCSD's young history coming up, I'm not sure anyone was too concerned about the Tritons' November 9th contest against Caltech in Pasadena. So, one of my favorite personal tweets of all time is from Cardale Jones, the quarterback for Ohio State a few years ago. Why should we have to go to class if we came here to play football? We didn't come to play school, classes are pointless. For Jones and a lot of top D1 athletes these days, that's probably true. But the California Institute of Technology in lovely Pasadena, California, like UCSD, doesn't offer athletic scholarships, and nobody is there to play football. More than anyone else in the country, they're there to play school. So if you haven't guessed already, this Caltech team is bad. Like, historically so. This leads to an incredibly entertaining feature on the team later in 1974 in the Wall Street Journal, some of which I just really want to read to you. Quote, "The 4 cheerleaders try in vain to arouse the little knot of 50 diffident students gathered in the stands here to watch their college play football. They give it another try. Cosine, tangent, hyperbolic sine, 3.14159, e to the x, dy, dx, slide rule, slipstick, tech. Much of this article reads like it's from The Onion. Receiver Tim Herbst is 5'5" and 108 pounds, and his coach tells him to stay away from everyone else. One player skips Monday practice to sing in the Glee Club. Steve Harvey, no, not that one, a columnist who ranks the worst college teams in the nation, has stopped listing Caltech because they're just in a class of their own. They started a 4-game schedule in 1974 with 23 players, and after 2 defections and injuries, they are just down to 15 men. 15! One of Gutman's proud moments is a game against Pomona College where the Beavers led at halftime 28-27. Final score, 74-28. The closest that Coach Tom Gutman has ever gotten to recruiting is lurking in the bushes around the school while the students played intramural touch football and jumping out periodically to persuade them to sign up for the school team. Most don't. They act like I had the plague or something, laments Gutman. Their fullback, Bruce Harrow, is taking courses in immunology, electron microscopy, and biophysics, and he researches protein sequencing. Fullback. The team is said to be the only one in the nation where the players' IQs approach their weights. The average player has an IQ of 140 and a GPA of 3.0. That'd be a 5.9 at Ohio State, jokes Gutman. This might have tactical advantages for Caltech, though, as Gutman says he once installed an entirely new offense mid-season, and the team executed it perfectly. After the scathing feature in the Journal, though, Caltech gets in one bit of revenge. Says school president Harold Brown, Caltech is about as well known for its football team as the Wall Street Journal is known for its sports section. Anyway, back to 1968. On the field, Caltech is led by quarterback Tom Burton. In high school, Burton was a third-string quarterback. At Caltech, he's the team's starting quarterback, a star defender, also the kicker, also the punter. Here he is in a particularly charming LA Times photo shoot holding a physics book. To put this matchup in perspective, UCSD has never won a football game, ever, and Caltech has lost 34 straight. As far as I can tell, none of the players in this game have literally ever won a college football game. But today, one of them is about to. They have to, right? This part of the video recapping the game could really use some fun visualizations, but I'm not John Boyce, I can't do that in Google Earth, so I need something a little more low-tech. Let's take it over to PowerPoint. Caltech strikes first on a run from half a yard out to go up 7-zip. In the second quarter, the Tritons start marching downfield, starting on their own 22. They get 23 yards on the ground from Belton Flournoy, then 16 more from Steve Garfilo. Quarterback Greg Gleason hits John Ringwood for 12 yards, and then Flournoy carries the ball 5 times in a row to get the ball to the Caltech 3. Gleason gets in for the score, and the Tritons even it up 7-7. On the next Beaver drive, the Tritons catch a break as Caltech fumbles the kickoff and Bob Dosh falls on the ball. Manuel Myers carries in a 13-yard touchdown on the ensuing drive. The extra point misses though, but UCSD still leads, 13-7. But after stalling on the next drive, a Caltech bomb leads to a devastating 58-yard pass interference call on the 2-yard line, and the Beavers take the lead back 14-13. Then it's the Tritons' turn to fumble at midfield, and the Beavers capitalize to go up 21-13. But UCSD marches down the field again, this time for 71 yards, capped off with a Garofalo touchdown run, but they fail the 2-point conversion and they go into halftime down 21-19. The Tritons fumble on the first possession of the second half, and while they stop the Beavers at the 5-yard line with a tremendous goal line stand after getting their only sack of the game, Burton runs it in on the next Tech possession. But crucially, he misses the kick, keeping it a one-possession game, 27-19. The UCSD offense does its job as Gleason hits Mike Heredia from 15 yards for the touchdown, but the necessary 2-point conversion to tie fails, and the Tritons are still down 27-25. After a stop, they had the ball once again, needing just a field goal to take the lead, but Gleason throws an interception deep in Triton territory to none other than Caltech quarterback / defensive back / kicker / punter / physics student Tom Burton, and 3 plays later, Tech scores the touchdown and Burton hits the extra point this time to push the lead to 2 possessions, 34-25. UCSD scores a quick touchdown on 4 passes to come within 3, but the Beavers fell on the critical onside kick to win the game. And Caltech went nuts. The players hoist Coach Tom Gutman on their shoulders in an undeniably John Madden-esque moment, although they don't carry him far since at 200 pounds, Gutman is larger than most of the players on his team. Many of the players weep openly. The California Tech newspaper the next day gave the win an entire page for the headline, declaring November 9th, 1968 V-Day. The Tech Pyros set a few bonfires, the largest on the corner of California and Lake. Says the newspaper recap, for the first time in many games, CIT faced a team in its class. They also misidentified the UCSD mascot as the Tritons, but whatever, who are we to disagree? We just lost to Caltech. The star of the game was undeniably Caltech quarterback Tom Burton, who went 14 for 23 for 150 yards passing, ran for 65 yards, scored 2 touchdowns, kicked 4 extra points, kicked off and punted for the Beavers, and had a key interception. But it was a pretty good game for the Tritons as well. They ran for a bruising 230 yards, and if they hadn't failed to convert 4 different point-after attempts, well, maybe things would have gone the other way. But hey, if they had, then you probably wouldn't be watching this documentary. Back in La Jolla, the tension is ramping up to 100. November 21st. The Triton Times publishes a special edition of the paper before the Regents meeting. Says the editorial board, it has been part of the standing orders of the Board of Regents since 1920 that the faculty has the authority over curricular matters, but Governor Reagan's resolution, which will be considered at this meeting, would return this authority to the Regents. Trying to avoid the previous commotion at Santa Cruz that many saw as undermining student demands, many on campus, including Chancellor McGill, asked that students not disrupt the meeting and follow the lead of associated students and the faculty ad hoc committee. In later years, though, McGill's recollections of his time with Ronald Reagan are not as fond.
His stock in trade as a politician is a kind of nice guy image, but in fact, as a real person rather than a political image, he was a rather mean, uncompassionate, very hard-bitten person. What struck me as I got to know him a little bit was that he had absolutely no understanding of any of these ideological concerns and no sympathy at all with the idealism of students.
But for some, standing down isn't enough. Starting on the 19th, members of the Black Student Council and the Mexican American Youth Association, or MAYA, start a 3-day hunger strike protesting the Reagan resolutions. Students splay themselves out on the floor of Blake overnight. Some leaders and associated students worry about the possibly violent reactions of hundreds of students who hadn't eaten anything but water, black tea, or coffee in 3 days in case things don't go their way. Some speculate that this might be the point. Off campus lurk Eldridge Cleaver and George Murray, the Black Panthers Minister of Education, whose suspension from San Francisco State just 2 weeks ago would kick off what would become a 5-month strike, the longest student strike in U.S. history. Cleaver and Murray are in town for the meeting, but they've announced that they will only come to the UCSD campus on the assurance that there will be no trouble. Prior to the Regents meeting, the Committee on Educational Policy meets at main gym and reinforces their previous resolution to disallow multiple guest lectures by the same individual in both credit and non-credit courses. They even extend the previous resolution by arguing that only the UC president can authorize exceptions to this policy, despite pleas to the contrary by UCSD AS President Tom Shepard and Berkeley Professor John Searle. As summarized by the Triton Times. Notice, the following resolution was adopted at yesterday's Educational Policy Committee meeting. Whereas, bloop bloop de blop, therefore be it resolved, OINK, OINK, OINK. As the Regents arrive for their meeting on November 22nd in the Revelle parking lot, they are met by thousands of UCSD students and faculty. But they aren't unruly, yelling, drowning out Reagan and the Regents like expected. They're dead silent.
And there was a debate on what kind of a demonstration we're going to have, the faculty, and they did vote it would be silent.
With absolute silence. So there was a mass of hundreds of students waiting there, and it made him very angry. It was a very successful. Since he was used to being yelled at by students, and indeed that was a very useful matter for him politically.
Reagan's style as governor was to try to provoke these attacks. And if he could provoke an outburst, then people would say, see how they treat our governor.
Governor, what do you think of this well-disciplined, quiet demonstration compared to some of the disturbances you've encountered in the past? This is purposely done this way.
Well, and I'm very appreciative of it. I think it's a little more adult than some of the things we've seen in the past.
They hope that this will have an effect on the region in their decisions today.
Well, it would be fine if they really understood what was going on, but they don't.
You don't think they understand what's going on?
No.
Of course, some people, even the faculty, can't resist making a little noise. UCSD literature professor Reinhard Latau.
And the whole faculty and campus was standing there dead silent. And somebody behind me, it might have been Peter, said oink, oink, real loud, quietly. And Marcuse yelled real loud, who said oink, oink? That kind of thing I enjoyed very much. He was immensely ugly, Reagan. I said that to him as he passed.
In the Regents meeting proper, Regent Roth starts off the debate speaking against the September resolutions, calling them an overreach on faculty authority to much applause from the student audience. He's backed up by Regents Dutton and Unruh, who want to keep these matters in the hands of the faculty. But ultimately, after much discussion, Reagan and his conservative majority win out, with a report of the Educational Policy Committee on guest lecturers being adopted 13-7. But the adopted report is a compromise, not as harsh as the one originally proposed by Reagan, making this somewhat of a mixed bag. In a faculty committee meeting, Professor Sam Barron calls the withdrawal of the Reagan resolutions a considerable victory. Reagan's resolution would have terminated the Cleaver-Berkeley course altogether and infringed on faculty power to award degrees and make appointments, while the actually passed resolution, though still objectionable in his terms, would allow the course to continue, although without credit, and made guest lecturers easier to obtain. Not everyone agrees, however. Nonetheless, the passing of the resolution kicks off action all over campus over the next few days, which gives you sort of a hint of what campus organizing looked like back in the day. A group of 100 students attempt to disrupt the Regents meeting after hearing that the resolution had passed, chanting, "Regents no, Cleaver see," but by the time they reach main gym, most of the Regents were gone and the gym was being set up for the evening dance. Defeated, the students returned to Revelle Plaza. On Monday morning, some 300 students and 59 faculty members who have cancelled classes for the occasion attend a convocation in Revelle Plaza to discuss UC issues. The theme is, "The University is dead, long live the University." Effigies of the Regents hang from the trees. The general mood is that the Regents' decision is not a full loss but an unsatisfactory compromise. But the action around campus has impressed some of the swing Regents, and the consensus is that UCSD represented itself well. Multiple students and faculty speak, including leaders from BSc and Maya, Chairman Monk of the Academic Senate, and some calls are made for the elimination of the Revelle humanities requirement, and even the elimination of grades altogether, which one speaker calls that capitalist competition thing that they force on us. But in another escapade, some students feel like talking just isn't enough. After all, though some courses have been cancelled, some have not been, and not everyone on campus is here for the convocation. An emotional, highly personal plea from a Revelle junior inspires the crowd of a couple hundred to start moving en masse to pick up supporters. They go first to the library in Galbraith Hall, where student leaders of the crowd of 200 people implore a surprise group of studying students to join the march. They then move to USB, now York Hall 2722, where they attempt to disrupt Professor Carmack's course. Carmack has already dedicated the hour to talking about the Regents meeting instead of his normal lecture, and this earns a rebuke from Professor Stroll, who was part of the student group and argues that this is a violation of academic freedom itself. Stroll is then shouted down by several students. Upon reaching Carmack's class, the group is invited to stay and discuss the Regents resolution, but they decide to move on. Next, the students interrupt a biology class in session in USB 2622, with this professor being a bit less receptive to the interruption. A vote is held, and much to the chagrin of the marchers, a majority of the students actually just vote to stay in class, leading to some name-calling. The next stop is the Humanities Library Auditorium, where the exact same case is made, before returning to Revelle Plaza to decide on next steps. The move to attract more supporters seems to have failed, and indeed there seem to be less students now than before the march. At this time, Chancellor McGill shows up, calling the Regents meeting a victory, and says that he opposes the class boycott unless it's supported by the whole academic community. For these statements, McGill is heckled so much that student leaders felt forced to apologize to him later. The same day as the Regents meeting, the Triton Times publishes news of yet another UC San Diego loss, although this one might be the best game they've played all season. A respectable 27-6 defeat to undefeated Nevada Southern, now known as UNLV, in Las Vegas. Just like against Laverne, UCSD starts off with the first touchdown, but they never score again, although they don't fall behind until late in the third quarter. The Tritons will lose next week to St. Mary's College in the Bay Area, 27-13. It will be the last football game UC San Diego will ever play. It doesn't even make the school newspaper. The only 7 games of football UC San Diego will ever play don't end with a bang, or even a whimper. Like Chancellor McGill, they are drowned out by noise. Life continues at UCSD, if not as usual. The Triton Times sports editor makes his college football bowl game picks. I find picking against Heisman Trophy winner O.J. Simpson like picking against God, he says. Unfortunately, I cannot yet have the pleasure of picking UCSD to win a bowl game. Maybe next year, gang. He will never get that chance, as debate began to brew over the future of athletics at UCSD. Chancellor McGill had appointed a committee to explore the university's athletics future, but the results it returned with were conflicting and inconclusive. The committee issued both a majority and a minority report, with the majority arguing for limited subsidization of athletics, and the minority wanting none at all. Again, however, athletics are overshadowed by larger campus issues. Professor Herbert Marcuse, the new left public intellectual and UCSD's most discussed faculty member, is 3 years past the recommended retirement age of 68 for university professors. Therefore, his contract must be renewed on a yearly basis by Chancellor McGill. 1,000 students sign a petition supporting his rehiring, but Marcuse has enemies too. The local branch of the American Legion, the veterans organization, vehemently opposes Marcuse's rehiring.
Recently, wherever they had a riot in Europe, they had the riots in Rome, and Marcuse showed up. They had the riots in Paris when the French had to bring out the troops in the tanks. Marcuse was there. When they had the riots with the students in Berlin, Marcuse was there. It seems to be that wherever the radicals in this new left, so-called new left, appear, Marcuse somewhere is in the background. We are convinced that he has to convey some of his ideas and thoughts directly to the students, and in this lies the danger of Marcuse to the University of California.
Indeed, just earlier this year, the Legion had offered to pay UCSD to buy out the remaining $20,000 of Marcuse's contract just to stop him from teaching as soon as possible.
And I suddenly realized that I was in conflict with the American Legion over Herbert Marcuse when they wrote me a letter.
The Legion proposes to offer $20,000 to buy up Professor Marcuse's contract. You don't buy up a professor's contract. You can't even do this with a professional football player, and a university is a far more responsible place in our society.
But it wasn't just the Legion pressuring McGill to fire Marcuse either.
That offered to do this came to me personally, but it also was, I read it in the newspapers before I got it, so that I could see what was up here. And it's perfectly evident to me that they were working hand in glove with the editor of the local newspaper here in San Diego Union.
You have a very extreme professor, such as Marcuse, poisoning, literally poisoning, a lot of young minds with what I would consider to be some of the most irresponsible drivel that I've ever read or heard. And I think that we should focus more on training these young people to be productive citizens and not to dissect and examine the whys and wherefore, the motives of human beings, and to try to find some aberration upon which to fix.
Some of Marcuse's enemies are less subtle about their opposition, however.
Also a pile of letters from the 1960s addressed to Marcuse.
Hey, you worthless pig. I hope you are soon eliminated from this country, and I hope the world, you anarchist, atheist, murderer.
After learning of your classroom antics, I have come to wonder, along with many veterans of World War II, if Hitler wasn't right after all. Marcuse, you are a very dirty communist dog. We give you 72 hours to live in the United States. 72 hours more, Marcuse, and then we kill you.
We ourselves, some of us, carried arms in order to protect Marcuse. After Malcolm X was killed, Bobby Kennedy was killed, we thought it was possible for someone to assassinate him. And at that point, some of us were prepared to fire on an assassin.
With so much on his plate, all McGill can say is that he hasn't made a decision yet. By the way, I hope I can make clear to you like how much random, interesting stuff I'm skipping to make this thing shorter. Like that weekend, Ike and Tina Turner are playing the Revelle cafeteria. They're just like in the cafeteria doing a concert. That's a pretty big get for a cafeteria. The Chinese national basketball team is playing an exhibition match against the UCSD team. By the way, did you know that basketball players used to be called cagers because before the 1920s, the court would often be surrounded by a cage to prevent the ball from going out of bounds and separating the crowd from the players? Oh, and what about this other thing? The next week, the Muir College Dorm Council declares itself to be the legitimate student government of the new Muir College, challenging a fledgling existing structure whose Bill of Rights convention was interrupted by last quarter's Regents meeting. At stake between the two competing governments is, and I'm not making this up, the money allotted to the eventual Muir government by the vending machine committee, which I can only assume is a bunch of quarters. Anyway, the sports debate rolls on. A group of former professors from Ohio State warned that UCSD could go down the same dark path of big-time athletics, which is kind of comical to imagine happening today. At Ohio State, they say, the wives of freshman coaches write papers for athletes. UCSD should never subsidize athletics, they say. What, after all, is wrong with trying to beat Caltech at its own game? The irony, of course, in that statement is that we couldn't even beat Caltech at football, which is, let me tell you, the polar opposite of their own game. Even sports editor Larry Revelle says that UCSD doesn't need athletic scholarships and that we're above the level of mediocrity already. Like the professors, Revelle says that we shouldn't be afraid of becoming Caltech, we should be excited about it. But with campus support for athletics slim, the football project begins to fall apart. Head coach Walt Hackett accepts a job with the Pittsburgh Steelers under former Chargers colleague and future Hall of Fame coach Chuck Noll, running the defensive line. Behind one of the most legendary defenses of all time, Noll will go on to win 4 Super Bowls. Hackett will not win any, but I'm getting ahead of myself. After weeks of deliberation, Chancellor McGill has made the decision to rehire Herbert Marcuse.
The University of California, San Diego today announced its intention to reappoint Dr. Herbert Marcuse as Professor of Philosophy for the academic year 1969-70.
While this wins support on campus, this puts McGill in the crosshairs of every conservative in California. State Assemblyman John Stahl says that McGill has openly placed himself on the side of those elements which seek to destroy our society, and calls for his dismissal. The American Legion calls on the state legislature to cut the exact amount of Marcuse's salary out of UCSD's budget. But McGill's decision isn't just to rehire Marcuse. Indeed, to counterbalance the Marcuse decision, McGill strengthens the retirement age for professors, making it mandatory.
Accordingly, we have decided to terminate all existing commitments to overage professors as of June 1970. And to replace these with a policy of expected retirement at a specified age.
But even the Marcuse matter isn't settled yet. McGill leaves the door open for the Regents to review his decision, and he won't formally sign the contract until after the Regents meeting next week. This leads to some criticism on campus, as after all, McGill could just sign Marcuse's contract himself. But this decision sets up yet another conflagration, this time at UC Berkeley, which is already in the midst of a roiling student strike. The formal Regents meeting, like always, is preceded by an unprecedentedly long 6-hour closed-door Committee on Educational Policy meeting, featuring a half-hour address by Assemblyman Stull, who says that the Regents seemed receptive to firing Marcuse, if not firing Chancellor McGill himself or forcing him to resign. But with the Regents and Ronald Reagan on campus, the Berkeley Third World Liberation Front strike that had been in progress for nearly a month escalated rapidly. Thanks to a Reagan-declared state of emergency, the Alameda County Sheriff is in charge of the police response, and he declares any gathering of more than 6 students illegal. On Wednesday, police clubbed and maced protesters in what some local newspapers described as the worst violence ever on the Berkeley campus. The next day, it got worse. As we learned from Triton Times reporters Tom Baker and Clay Anderson on the scene, students began to throw rocks and chant "pigs off campus," and every so often, police pump-fake throwing tear gas as a deterrent. There is 20 yards between the front lines of either side. Suddenly, the police spring into action, releasing tear gas on the crowd of 3,000, flanking the protesters, advancing through Sadler Gate, and taking Sproul Plaza. Our intrepid reporters jump over a wall, which Tom Baker calls the best form he has ever displayed, but he loses his notepad in the process. Students respond by smashing a police car. The police then bring out a bizarre-looking tear gas machine gun at the crowd, but the wind comically forces the gas back onto the police lines. One student throws a flower at an officer, and is then beaten to a bloody pulp by 6 cops and taken away. Meanwhile, students on rooftops throw cherry bombs and rocks down onto the police, and police respond by letting loose 30 tear gas canisters in a 2-minute span, absolutely filling Sproul Plaza with gas and sending students scattering. The gas forms a 40-foot bluish-gray cloud that swirls over the entire plaza, blotting out even the sun. Fiat lux indeed. Though it seems that the worst fears of looting have been avoided, indeed shop owners are letting protesters in to escape the gas, although some fires are set. One huge, wild-eyed man has reportedly beat the hell out of the traffic light boxes with a pipe, putting many of Berkeley's intersections out of order. As night falls, cops from all over the Bay Area patrol the streets with shotguns. Student leaders predict that the National Guard will be called in by tomorrow at the latest, and this is all before the official open session Regents meeting. Ultimately, the Regents meeting itself on Friday is less dramatic than expected. Nothing is done about Marcuse, although only by a narrow margin, but there was reportedly an 8-hour closed-door executive session almost dedicated entirely to Marcuse. McGill was grilled at length about his decision, and he's ultimately allowed to remain as chancellor, although he says his tail feathers have been singed considerably. This wins McGill a massive wave of support from the UCSD community, but on the other hand, Ronald Reagan seemed to misplay the meeting, as McGill states that the governor arrived unaware of McGill's strategy and was only able to rant and rave, not gather the votes he needed against Marcuse and McGill. In fact, not only has the Regents meeting been less explosive than expected, but it's matched by relative calm outside. Why? Says reporter Tom Baker. The possibility of a recurrence of the previous days of violence was destroyed by rain, which proved to be the most effective crowd control technique presently known. When philosophy master's student Angela Davis arrived to the UC San Diego campus in 1967, she would later recall, "Each day brought a more profound dejection, for there were still no black people on campus. I roamed the campus, examined the bulletin boards, read the newspapers, talked to everyone who might know. Where are my people?" As a student at UCSD, before she would become a controversial professor, a member of the FBI's most wanted list, and a household name, Davis, along with other Black Student Council undergrads and Professor Keith Lowe, helped author a proposal for a third college, centered around the liberation of minority communities.
A college. We wanted a college. They were about to construct the third college. We said the name of this college is going to be Lumumba Zapata College. Oh, yes. And we developed a curriculum.
We developed the idea of creating a college that would reflect the needs of the academic as well as community needs of people of African descent, Latinos, and working class white people.
In March 1969, the students made their request to Chancellor McGill for a third UCSD college, radically different from the other two. It was to be named Lumumba Zapata College, after early 20th century Mexican revolutionary Emiliano Zapata and assassinated Congolese independence leader Patrice Lumumba. The college would have a curriculum centered around the needs of minority communities and critical analysis of capitalism and Western culture. Chancellor McGill predictably takes a few issues with this proposal, especially the nature of the proposed curriculum and the proposed quotas that the new college should consist of 35% each Black and Hispanic students, which would likely be illegal. But the plan slowly gains support, including from the Associated Student Senate, which endorses it the following week. Meanwhile, the controversy over athletics is reaching a head as Triton athletes make demands of their own. A group of 28 varsity athletes from the football and basketball teams seek financial benefits and PE credits for their participation, and if they don't receive it, they will refuse to compete next year. In a guest editorial, a representative of these athletes writes of the difficulties UCSD athletes have faced. About half of both the miserable football team and the successful basketball team will not be returning, as well as both of their head coaches. Last fall, the campus cafeteria didn't even stay open for football players returning from practice, eventually relenting only to offer starved players leftover salad and yogurt. The athletes want UCSD to offer athletes jobs, allow private donors to fund scholarships, and waive student fees for athletes. We are athletes who refuse to be humiliated any longer, they say. All the schools on our schedules excepting Caltech finance their athletes. We refuse to be another Caltech. We refuse to become the laughingstock of Southern California. But with the committee he appointed failing to come to a decision, McGill announces that the issue of allowing private assistance for athletics will come to a student referendum in the upcoming elections. The future of UCSD athletics and the life of the football team itself will be on the ballot. In next week's newspaper, both sides make their case. The athletes write that they don't want to be either the mediocre teams of Caltech or the juggernaut of Ohio State. They just simply want a 50-50 shot when they go into a game. UCSD is already much bigger than the schools that they lose to, and after 1970, most of our opponents will refuse to schedule UCSD due to its rapid growth. Meanwhile, the Triton Times editorial opposes scholarships for athletes, instead proposing an alternative that today sounds ridiculous to UCSD students, that the colleges of UCSD should have their own sports teams and just play each other. The long-term plan for UCSD is to have 12 colleges of 2,700 students each, and so we could indeed have Revelle football play against Mohr football. Remember that from 2 years ago? In conclusion, they say winning isn't all that matters. After all, the New York Mets haven't made it out of the cellar yet, but their attendance is often among the highest in the league. In an ironic twist, the editors seem to have jinxed it, as the Mets are going to shock the world by winning their first World Series later this year. In the week leading up to the election, the Lumumba Zapata College proponents cause fierce debate and deadlock in an academic senate meeting, and along with Professor Marcusa, they eventually walk out. After walking out again the next day, around 50 of the students eventually decide to occupy the registrar's office, with one unidentified student smashing the glass door.
We wanted to demonstrate the extent to which we were serious. We decided to occupy the registrar's office. So I went to Marcusa and told him about our plans. And I asked him whether he would come with us. No question about it, of course. And as a matter of fact, when we took over the building, we had to we had to kick in the door, break the glass, and the first person to occupy the building, the first person to set foot into the building was Herbert Marcusa.
Back at the Senate meeting, Dean Murphy announces that 50 students were sitting in the registrar's office and calls on the Senate to give him something to go to the students with. This followed hours of inaction, which one professor called farting around. After passing a resolution, Murphy asks fellow faculty members to walk over to the registrar's office with him. To quote the Triton Times reporter on the scene, as the faculty left the meeting, this reporter ironically noted that Chairman Monk and several others had no idea where the registrar's office was. After news of the resolution is received, the demonstrators decide to leave the building in a democratic vote, 29 to 23. Dean Murphy says that no disciplinary action will be taken, especially since nobody knows who actually broke the door. But even though nobody's getting arrested, somebody's gonna have to pay for that door.
This afternoon, Dr. McGill held a news conference, and he discussed last night's incident.
The matter's not closed. Somebody's going to have to come forward and pay for that door.
It was very mysterious. One day a letter arrived, and inside the letter was a money order for the amount on the bill. No signatories, no indication of who was paying it. And I figured that I wouldn't inquire, the matter was settled.
And Marcusa paid for the door. Yeah, he went and I don't know, it must have, I don't know, $20, $50, whatever it was. So he paid for the door of the registrar's office.
Okay. That week in the Triton Times, Maya BSc makes a statement that it should be understood that the passing of the resolution has been a significant advance, but we still do not have Lumumba Zapata. By the way, we won't get to the end of the third college story in the time frame we're covering, but if you want to learn more, check out Chapter 6 of former UCSD professor Jorge Mariscal's book about the Chicano movement in this decade, Brown-Eyed Children of the Sun, which I will link below. By a landslide margin of 572 to 1,630, 26 to 74%, the student referendum on financial assistance for athletics fails. The next day, it is announced that UCSD is dropping its football program after just 1 year. The program is already on remand, and even fewer students are interested in competing next year. Many had already transferred out. 462 days after the very first meeting with Coach Hackett, the Triton football program breathes its last gasp, never to return. But in a story you must find familiar by now, even the death of the football program is overshadowed by other occurrences. Time to go back to Berkeley. In 1967, UC Berkeley had acquired a 2.8-acre plot of land through eminent domain, and beginning on April 20th, 1969, over 1,000 people began to build, by themselves, what became known as People's Park out of the once derelict lot. While the university still owned the property, Berkeley Chancellor Roger Hines promised nothing would be done without warning. Unfortunately, Governor Ronald Reagan was a bit less concerned with keeping those promises. At dawn on May 15th, Reagan sent Highway Patrol and Berkeley PD into People's Park, clearing 8 blocks around it, destroying much of the plants and installing a perimeter fence. That day, a rally of about 3,000 people in Sproul Plaza, originally about the Arab-Israeli conflict, turned to the issue of the park. Student body president Dan Siegel shouted, without realizing what this would cause, "Let's take the park." The police shut down the sound system, but it was too late, as the crowd began to move towards the park. What followed would dwarf the violence of February. The crowd, now swelled to 6,000, attempted to tear down the fence and throw items at officers, and they were met with tear gas. Cars were set on fire. In response, the 159 officers at the park were joined by the county sheriff's office, bringing their ranks to 791. Reagan's chief of staff, Edwin Meese, former Alameda County DA and a Berkeley Law alum, was in charge of the police response, and he authorized officers to use any methods they chose. The officers hid their badges to avoid identification and, clad in riot gear, headed into the crowd with nightsticks and pursued them down several blocks, firing tear gas and even buckshot, which the officers would later lie about using, at the backs of fleeing protesters. 25-year-old James Rector was visiting friends from San Jose and watching from a roof when he was shot by Alameda sheriffs from the street, caught on camera by reporters from the Berkeley student paper, the Daily Californian. It took 25 minutes to get a stretcher up to Rector, and there's no evidence that anyone in uniform ever came to help. 4 days later, Rector was dead. Doctors found buckshot, many times larger than the bird shot that sheriffs said they were using, lodged in Rector's aorta. To quote a San Francisco Chronicle retrospective, the official inquiry found no evidence that anyone on the roof of Granma Brooks had thrown anything at police on the street. But a disassembled .22 caliber rifle was found in the trunk of Rector's car, and that was all the evidence Governor Ronald Reagan needed. The death of James Rector should again serve as a bitter lesson that violence and revolution will lead to nothing but chaos and further bloodshed, Reagan said. The casualties didn't end there. A local carpenter, Alan Blanchard, was permanently blinded. One CHP officer was knifed in the chest. Hundreds of Berkeley residents were seriously injured, with many too afraid to go to the hospital for fear of arrest. Reagan responded by declaring a state of emergency and sending in 2,700 National Guard troops, who patrolled the streets, breaking up any demonstrations for the next 2 weeks with tear gas. For their part, young Berkeley women teased the troops and in one episode handed out marijuana-laced brownies and everything from fudge, lemonade to oranges spiked with LSD to the occupying forces. 5 days later, National Guard helicopters dropped tear gas on the Berkeley campus, and predictably this led to clouds of wind-dispersed gas over the entire city, affecting thousands of bystanders, and even sending schoolchildren miles away to hospitals. Reagan later concedes that this might have been, quote, a tactical mistake. On May 21st, Reagan has a meeting with UC professors about the events at Berkeley.
Over 100 people have been shot down. 100 people that I'm sure the record will show. Gas, lethal gas, that has been classified, as far as I know, as being used.
Once the dogs of war are unleashed, you must expect that things will happen and people being human will make mistakes on both sides. But this violence...
We're here because people are being shot and killed today in Berkeley.
He said to me at one point that he had all the experience he needed with communists in Hollywood during the 1940s. And he said, the only thing they understand is force. So we'll give them force.
Negotiate? What is to negotiate? What is...
Governor Reagan, the time has passed when the university can just ride roughshod over the desires of the majority of its student body.
Well,
the university is a public institution.
That's
it's
right.
An important institution
but the university,
for all of its own community and for the community of Berkeley that live around it.
All of it began the first time some of you who know better and are old enough to know better let young people think that they had the right to choose the laws they would obey as long as they were doing it in the name of social protest.
Reagan would again defend his decisions on the one-year anniversary of the violent response to the protests. If it takes a bloodbath, let's get it over with. No more appeasement. The reaction around the UC system was swift and immediate. Every UC campus has at least talks of a boycott, and at Berkeley, some National Guard troops are even refusing to fight. At UCLA, the regents are having a very poorly timed meeting. Thousands surround the meeting chamber, pounding on the walls and windows and rendering Reagan's press conference inaudible. But he stands firm. In La Jolla, a student strike was called, with students demonstrating and occupying buildings all over campus. Per the Triton Times, most classes were cancelled, half empty, or discussing Berkeley and the strike. The next day, 2,000 people crammed into the gym for a convocation where Chancellor McGill, who opposes the strike, Linus Pauling, Herbert Marcuse, and even Angela Davis alike discussed the state's actions in Berkeley. Says Pauling, who has already announced his departure to Stanford in large part due to Reagan's threats towards academic freedom, "We are tired of sending telegrams to those in power, begging for justice." For their part, alongside their normal sports recap, the Triton Times sports section jokingly lists the exploits of the Alameda County Sheriff's head-busting team for one of their best performances of the year in an unscheduled weekend game, to which the lucky governor has a season ticket. If all goes according to the governor's plan, it says, this will not be the only weekend game. Other games will be held at Davis, Santa Barbara, Los Angeles, Irvine, Santa Cruz, and San Diego. There don't exist any clear records I can find of when the strike ended. It was seemingly finished by the Triton Times' final issue of the quarter on June 6th, though, where the editors condemned McGill's opposition to the strike, and the chancellor responded by emphasizing his responsibility for protecting UCSD from the waves of irrationality washing over every major campus in the country. To what I'm sure was the relief of Chancellor McGill, the year, mercifully, comes to a close. And there, too, does our journey through 2 years at UC San Diego end. Sorry if it's a little anticlimactic. Things are like that sometimes. Walt Hackett, the only football coach in UC San Diego history, died on April 24th, 1971, aged just 47. He was back in California to scout the Long Beach State football team, and while in conversation with Long Beach head coach Jim Strangeland, he just keeled over and was dead on arrival to the hospital. Per his obituary, Hackett, a happy, fun-loving guy, was responsible for developing the Steeler defensive line. That Steeler defense will later become one of the most feared units in NFL history, and it will lead the Steelers and Hackett's buddy Chuck Noll to 4 NFL titles in the 1970s. Hackett's death goes unmentioned in the Triton Times, but in what is, as far as I can tell, a coincidence, the week after his death, the sports editor's column in the Triton Times calls for the return of football to UCSD. Now that the school has grown and some not-so-involved kids have infiltrated the campus, a new birth is at hand. In 1985, Roger Revelle was interviewed as part of a series of interviews with several prominent participants in the university's founding on its 25th anniversary. I highly recommend you check them all out, by the way. In that interview, he said, "I often feel that maybe I made a mistake putting the campus here. A community for students has never really arisen in the area surrounding UCSD, an area where the students can just be themselves, unlike Berkeley or Boston, which Revelle wanted to emulate." In 1992, a year after Revelle's death, Guardian editor-in-chief Jason Snell wrote an article about the state of Revelle's vision. UCSD has great rankings, has become the most successful university founded post-World War II, but the university Roger Revelle dreamed about from his perch on the beach ridge 30 years ago, it doesn't exist. There isn't a university community surrounding the campus for students, and many of the students find UCSD to be a pretty impersonal place. Snell concludes with the same story about ribbons on trees that I mentioned at the beginning. It's 30 years later, says Snell. The university has come to fruition, and nobody ties ribbons anymore. 30 years after that, I wanted to end here with some sort of broad statement about UCSD, about Revelle's vision, how I find the UCSD of today so unlike the school it was in 1968, but I don't really know what to say. The university is now a large, prestigious, world-class research institution with D1 sports, a transit link to downtown, and billions of dollars of funding. But the 12-college Oxford-style community of the future that Roger Revelle embarked on 60 years ago is decidedly not what UCSD is today. I couldn't tell you whether we're a better place than we were in 1968. What I can tell you is that as a university, we don't know our history. I started this project because I wanted to tell a little story about the football team. What I found was that the football team was probably the least interesting thing that happened on campus that year. No official UCSD sources really dive at any length into the topic. Ultimately, this place seems to just be zooming into the future so fast it takes little to no care into being a custodian of its past. Do UCSD students know about Herbert Marcuse? About Lumumba Zapata? About the football team? I've walked through Revelle Plaza a few hundred times. Did I learn anything about what happened there? I keep coming back to that quote from 1968 about being a UCSD student. It seems to be a characteristic of the normal Revellian to be bored and not to care. We do nothing, we feel nothing, and we do not really care. Quite possibly, boredom is the basis of our identity. If students arrive on this campus and learn nothing about its history, only how prestigious we are academically, can they ever really learn to call it home? The primary people I had to thank here are the journalists of the Triton Times from 1967 to 1969. They had literally just started a student newspaper in 67, and they had to hand-align the pages, type without computers, reach out to sources without emails, be on location for events, and they had to cover so goddamn much happening in San Diego and around the country. While they left a few typos and holes in their coverage, they've left by far the most dense historical record about the first few years of UCSD's history, and without them I could never dream of being able to tell this story. And as someone who has loved being in the UCSD Guardian, the newspaper that they started, and meeting so many people there, I owe them so much. I also want to thank everyone in my life who has listened to me talk about this stuff and still continued to be my friend for some reason, whether it's the people in UCSD Quiz Bowl, my roommates, my friends from research, my family, or my buddies from today's UCSD Guardian. And thanks to the library's Digital Media Lab for having Premiere Pro to allow me to edit this video. Final shout out goes to Secret Base's John Boyce, the creative genius who have completely stolen the aesthetics, style, and narrative philosophy of this video from. If you manage to sit through this entire video, then you'll love his stuff. It's so much better than this. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about anything in this video, let me know in the comments or email me. I would love to find out more.